Just for gate crashing with my little son. His mother's not been too well lately, so he's kind of a carer. He comes everywhere with me.
Could you please kindly speak louder?
I'm just saying apologies for not being able to deliver it in Norwegian. I wish I could. And apologies for gate crashing with this little guy. His mother's not well, so I tend to have to. He comes everywhere with me, so. But he's quiet, so don't worry. Right, the topic I was asked to talk about was Islamic culture, and what I plan to do, if it's okay with you, is to go over this presentation quite quickly, relatively quickly, just so people know what I'm trying to say. And then I'd like to go back and go over it again, but this time with discussion, so you kind of know where I stand, and then we can discuss the issues. Because I think that's actually the most important thing here, is if we can get some dialogue, some kind of discussion about what the issues are. So, why is it important? Is one of the questions I'm asking. And of course the title is Islamic culture, so there's two questions that need to be answered. What is Islam? And what is culture? And then probably the crux of what it's all about is what happens when two cultures come into, when they meet and they're not in tune. What are the consequences of that? And that's what we're really facing here. And finally, what lessons are there to be? What is the way forward? So they're the 5 things that I'd like to address during this presentation. And so the first question of why is it important is quite simple. But there's a lot of misunderstandings. There's misunderstandings about what Islam is. There's misunderstandings about what culture is. And when you put those two misunderstandings together, you get a climate of what we've got now, which is a climate of fear and mistrust from lots of different people. Alienation, and we've got polarization, and in some cases conflict. So it is an important subject for all of those reasons. Within the Muslim community, you'll see that those same conflicts that I'm talking about, the wider society, they're actually on a different scale within the community. So it's not as if there's a homogeneous Muslim community out there. What you have is you have a Muslim community which is internally conflicted, and then in conflict with its external agents or external partners or external communicators. So it's not a simple thing here. So we have external conflict and internal conflict, and as a result of that, we have a generation of people who are being brought up in this state of conflict and a state of lack of clarity, and that's why it's important to go back to these questions so that we can at least get some dialogue to, in effect, of try and avoid that Armageddon scenario where it could go back to the way things were in 1939, before the war. So it is a dangerous time, and it's something that I think we need to be honest about and face up to these discussions, and that's why I accepted this offer to come here to hopefully be part of that discussion. So let's look at what those other questions were. First of all, we need to think about what is Islam, and that's part of what the conflict or the misunderstanding is about. And some people see Islam as a set of rules, and we'll come back to that. Some people just see Islam is just simply a set of rules. You do this, you do that, you do this, you do that, you do this, you do that, and it's just like a machinery. So that is one understanding. The other understanding is it's actually just a culture club. One of the things that I don't know if Amir explained, that my role professionally is as an inclusion officer. So my job, I work in education, and the element of education that I'm responsible for is inclusion. And the Arabic word for inclusion is actually the Arabic word for a mosque, jami', to include, the place of inclusion. However, mosques, sadly, are not inclusive. So we've actually got a contradiction here between what they should be and what they are. And one of my teachers and friends, Dr. Abdul Hakim Winters, Timothy Winters, he said that the word should be inclusion, but it's actually just a culture club or a racial club, and that's why in some places, less so in Norway, but certainly where my wife is from, they don't talk about the mosque, they talk about the Turkish mosque, or the Pakistani mosque, or the Arab mosque, and it's the same as if you were to say the Arab club or the Pakistani club. So the mosque has become something, and that's why if Islam is seen as just a culture club, then it will have a different kind of role in society. If it's seen as a set of rules, it'll be seen differently. And then some people put out this slogan, way of life. Islam is a way of life. And that has its consequences. And then other people see it as a set of principles that are applied in a social context. And that has a different kind of connotation. But we're going to come back to all of those, hopefully. So, if we've answered, or looked, at least asked the question, what is Islam? You want a water? Want to sit there? Stay here. Right, if you ask what's culture, what I've tried to do over there is to put two definitions, or two types of definitions. And as I said, I apologise for not speaking Norwegian, I wish I could. So it's a very English-Arabic type of definition, because on the one side we have the Cambridge English definition of what culture is, which is the ideas, customs and social behaviours of a particular people or society. And that's an important definition. It also uses a sociological definition, which is, interestingly, a way of life. So here, that idea of Islam and culture, there's some area already where there's some agreement. What I'd like to look on the other side is the Arabic terms. If you look up in an Arabic dictionary, what does culture mean? You'll come up with these words, thaqafa. Now, thaqufa in Arabic means to become skillful, quick, intelligent, light. So something that has thaqafa is something which is a high aspiration. And I want you to keep that word, that phrase, high aspiration. Thaqafa or culture is something which is high. And when we talk about culture, we usually talk about quality writing. We talk about Shakespeare in England. In America, we talk about Mark Twain. So this is something which we aspire to. And likewise in Arabic, we'll talk about high quality language or quality. So thaqafa is something, that's what thaqafa means. Hadara, this is an interesting word, especially if we're looking in a Norwegian context or a European context. Hadara means to settle, as opposed to be a traveller. Now why is that important? Is because a lot of people don't understand what Hadara means. Hadara means when you settle down, you settle into a city, you stop being a Bedouin. That's what the Arabic means. You stop being a Bedouin and you start living like a city person. And there's lots of writing about this by a great scholar called Ibn Khaldun, who was, some people say was one of the first sociologists. But in the modern context of what we're talking about here in Oslo, is that you have people who really have, I'll give you an example. Somebody referred to a family. They said, oh, the husband is a pindi, meaning he's a village boy. Whereas the wife, she's from the city. Now why is that relevant? It's because what people bring as immigrants in particular, now this I'm speaking specifically about immigrants, not talking about Norwegian Muslims. People that come, if you come with a culture or an understanding that's not from the city, then you haven't really got what we call in Arabic hadara. Because the hadara is how to live, literally how to live in a city. That's what it means. Culture means how to live in a city. But obviously, that varies from place to place. Haratha, if you go back to the English word culture, if you look historically what the word means, it comes from Middle English, means to dig a piece of land and to allow it to grow in a beautiful manner. That's what the word culture means. To dig the land and to make it grow in a beautiful manner. And the word haratha in Arabic is exactly the same meaning. To dig the land, to make it grow in a beautiful manner. So to culture something means to make it grow. What was the phrase I asked you to remember? Which I've now forgotten. High aspiration. A gardener only wants his garden to look beautiful. Why would you spend time in the garden if you don't want it to be beautiful? This is what we're talking about when we're talking about culture. And urf is another word for culture. What this means is something which has been established for generations. And I'll give you a couple of examples in a minute. As I said, I'm going to rush through this and then I'm going to go back. And when I go back, I want people to tear it to pieces and start fighting with me. Because that's what we're here to discuss. I want discussion. Somebody warned me, says, Norwegians are very shy. I says, not the Norwegians I've met. And I'm hoping you're the Norwegians that I'm used to, and you're going to lay into it and start discussing. So, next question. What happens when cultures meet? That actually depends on the first two questions that we've just talked about. Let's go back. What happens if your understanding of Islam is a set of rules, and then that set of rules is in contradiction or in conflict with a set of rules around you? I think I'll open that up to you. Any ideas, any suggestions, any comments?
For most cases, conflict maybe?
It will be a case of conflict, but then there are choices to be made by the people who hold fast to their sets of rules. And I'll give you some examples. I don't know if it's the same in Norway, but in England more than Scotland. By the way, I'm from Scotland. I was born in England, but live in Scotland, and I've been for the last 20 years. In England, they have organisations called the Sharia councils. Now, here is a place where we have conflict, because Sharia councils, by definition, see Islam as a set of rules. But those set of rules are not in tune, necessarily, with the set of rules of the country. And here is where, if you have this understanding, there's going to be a particular type of conflict. If it's a culture club, let's go back to those Pakistani mosques in Denmark and Turkish mosques in Denmark and all of those different types of... In fact, we even have sub-cultural mosques. Can I be really politically incorrect and racist? Please, my Pakistani brothers, forgive me. I grew up, I'm not a Pakistani, although now, alhamdulillah, I'm married somebody of Pakistani origin, so I kind of feel some affinity. But where I grew up, I didn't know a word of Urdu, and I didn't have any interest in speaking Urdu. All I knew is there was a mosque, and they used to fight between themselves. And one group was called Brelvi, and the other one was called Diabandi. And they used to fight. And then they had such a big fight that they went to court and they decided they couldn't stay in the same part of the mosque. So there was one room was for the Brelvis and one for the Diabandis. And the Brelvis played at 1 o'clock and the Diabandis played at 1:30. So in my mind, Islam was two groups, 1:30 group and the 1 o'clock group. And I was the 1:30 group because that's the time of my lunch. Until the 1 o'clock group, sorry. I think they were Diabandis, but anyway, it doesn't matter. Until one day I was late, so what did I do? I switched sides. I never went to that mosque again because I was never welcome. Here, if you have an understanding what Islam is, a culture club, you will never, ever, ever succeed. Never. Why? Because you will never ever convey your real belief to anybody. What you will do is you'll convey superficiality. And that's why that one in particular really, as you can see, upsets me. Okay, if it's a way of life, I'm going to leave this for a minute, because here, it really depends what people mean by way of life, because some people talk about way of life as if, yeah, Islam's a way of life, and it's just rhetoric. What they really mean, it's a culture club. Or it's a set of rules. And then so what exactly do people mean by it being a way of life? How does it impact on everything within that way of life? I'm not so sure anybody's really looked at this. So I'm going to leave it for a few minutes. And as I said, we're going to come back to this. And the last one, a set of principles. Now there are two problems, there are two things about this. One, I can see a problem. If it's a set of principles that then needs to be applied, how do we know that the application is actually correct? Because then what might happen is, well, I think, according to this principle, can I be really controversial? You're not going to ask me back anyway, so I'm just going to go out and do it. All right, let me say the most controversial thing I can. Okay, in my understanding, one of the principles of Islam is tolerance. I think that's stuck on your symbol over there somewhere. Okay? So, one of my best friends is gay. Well, many of my best friends are gay, actually. But this one particular person is the person I have in mind. So, after some time, he actually starts to show a great deal of interest in Islam and then decides to become Muslim. And now, there's a whole set of conflicts around all of the things that we just talked about above. Set of rules, culture club, oh my God. So, my understanding is he was my pal, he's still my pal, and I hope he will always be my pal. And I'm not going to have a problem with it, and I don't. Interesting thing is, because people understand that I have what they consider to be a different attitude to the imams, it's really strange. A lot of gay Muslims come up to me and talk about their sexuality. And a lot of people that are maybe gay but are struggling with their sexuality and have no one to talk to come to talk to me. And I have no problem with that, absolutely no problem at all. People might turn around and say, and as they have done, he's the gay imam. At what point am I know I'm controversial, and I know that I'm in a minority on a lot of issues, but at what point am I actually going beyond what is acceptable? Because I know I'm going beyond what's acceptable in the Muslim community, but at what point is there a measure of me going beyond what is acceptable in Islam? So there is a problem there. And there is a potential there that actually, if we start to talk honestly in this kind of framework, you'll see that actually we start to have reasonable dialogues with everybody, including my gay pals, who don't talk to anybody except me. So there are things to do with that. Let's go on to the next part. Okay, if thaqafa is what we're talking about, this high aspiration. To be honest, if you look back 100 years ago in Scandinavia, you will see a culture which had high aspirations. And this is something that's, have we got any Danish friends here? Because I've upset all the Pakistanis, now I'm going to upset all the Danes. No Danes? Oh, I'll just upset you again. You can tell Mummy I talked about Denmark, all right? Okay. Now, Denmark is interesting because my wife and many of my friends in Denmark, among the Muslims there, they feel quite, I would say, bullied. They feel uncomfortable in school. A lot of kids feel uncomfortable in school because they're told that as part of Danish culture, nudity is actually one of our cultural aspects, and therefore you have to bathe naked. From nursery. This is my wife, she said, yeah, we all bathe naked. We showered naked after PE, and it was just considered normal. Except in her case, her parents stopped her, and she became the freak, because she was the one person that wasn't allowed to wash after PE. Now, the people that advocate that say they do it in the name of Danish culture. But actually, I think they've misunderstood Danish culture, Because if you speak to somebody who's fairly old, fairly mature, in their 60s or 70s, they'll talk about a Denmark which actually respected each other in such a way that actually nudity wasn't part of their makeup. And even if you look back 40, 50 years, you'll actually see many of the women in Danish culture would be wearing scarves. And they had a great deal of modesty. And when people talk about culture, actually I think in many cases they've misunderstood what their true culture is. And you'll see that going back 100 years will not be that much difference. If you're looking, and what was that word I was talking about? I've forgotten again. Somebody had reminded me a minute ago. High aspirations. If you look at the high aspirations of society and not the low aspirations, you'll see that we're actually all aspiring for the same thing. Peace, tranquility, love, a community that works together, where people are respected. And when people are talking about those things, you'll actually find there's not a great deal of difference between any of the cultures who have high aspirations. So thaqafa is what we should be looking for. And we do need to live in Oslo. If you live in Oslo, you need to live in Oslo, not in Rawalpindi. Sorry. Or in Faisalabad, because one of the biggest problems is that when people import the village into the city, they fail. So that hadara is you need to know how to live. Harath we talked a little bit about. Urf. Let me just talk about urf. Urf is something which is well established. And I'm going to go back to that question of set of rules. Right. Can you tell me about what the rules of marriage are? What do you need to have for a marriage to be valid, to be acceptable in Islam?
Witnesses.
You need witnesses, okay. What else?
Intention to marry.
You have to have an intention to marry. You have to have
Wali.
a wali, somebody representing.
Consent from them.
You have to have consent. You have to have a bride and a groom. I thought wasn't that going to be the I pointed at a bride thinking that's going to be the obvious one. And what you need is a dowry. There needs to be, in Islamic law, there needs to be a payment or a gift of some sort from the husband to the wife, which has to be of value. It doesn't have to come from the wife to the husband, but it has to come from the husband to the wife. Okay, that's the law. Now, does it tell you what it needs to be? And does it exclude giving from the wife to the husband? No. Urf in the United Kingdom, in Scottish culture, is when two people get married, they get married with a ring. And the ring symbolises the union of a man and a woman. I think that is really sweet. Don't you? It's symbolic, and it's urf, it's culture, because it's been established for generations. Is it in contradiction to what you just told me about Islam? So therefore, the last wedding, not the last one, but the best wedding, I'm going to say, the best wedding that I ever performed, the husband and the wife sat there in the mosque next to me, David and Sophie. David gave the ring to Sophie, Sophie gave the ring to David. They put the ring on each other's fingers, and everybody was happy. And then we had sweets, and iron brew. Anyone know what iron brew is? You have to come to Scotland to understand that. Now here, that's not your traditional wedding, is it? Is it un-Islamic? Is it uncultured? For me, that is what we're really talking about. And that's why when we talk about the way forward, I'll give you two examples of the way forward. Just mention David. David Duncan, my pal, my wee Scottish pal. David Duncan is, for me, one of the loveliest people I've ever met. He's one of my best friends. You want to give the talk, huh? Just because it's of Mecca. Okay. He became Muslim, and he is somebody I really look up to. Not because he's got tremendous knowledge, but because he's just got really, what's that word I was looking for? High aspiration. He's got real high character. And I'll just give you an example of my pal David. We have what we call he had what we call a dawah store, an Islamic store. And I've never really been into this sort of stuff, but the way David did it was great. He had a store, and he just had anybody who wants to come and talk to him about Islam, he could come and talk to him. He's a guy from Oban in Scotland, and a lot of people would just come up to him, talk to him about Islam, and sometimes they become Muslim, sometimes they wouldn't, sometimes they go away anti-Islam. It didn't really matter. What was important was that he was there to talk to people. And there was these Egyptian Christians who came because they realised that he was now sort of actively talking about Islam, and they wanted to shut him up. So they came along and says, "Can you tell me what this verse of Quran means?" And they read it in Arabic, and they said, "This word means this." And they started being quite intimidating towards him. And he says, "No, I don't know. Would you like a brownie?" And they said, "No, I don't want a brownie. Tell me what this verse means." And he says, "I don't know. Would you like a brownie?" I don't know if you know what brownies are, but they're traditional Scottish cakes. And his mum makes the best brownies I've ever tasted. And he got the recipe. And his concept of dealing with people was, "I don't actually know. Would you like a brownie?" And for me, that's why I feel so comfortable with him, because he's so comfortable with who he is. And when he's that comfortable, he then met a lovely girl called Sophie, who, as you know, ends up marrying him. Now, Sophie met him. Sophie met him and just kind of really loved this guy. But what she loved about him was that he's just a really, really nice guy. And she tried to work out, well, what is it that's so nice about him? And it's actually David. His Davidness. And his ability to be who he is. She became Muslim. And as I said, he's actually from the Presbyterian Church, by the way. And so we had this wedding between David and Sophie. And only David's Muslim in his family. And only Sophie's Muslim in her family. So all of the guests were non-Muslim. So we have a Muslim wedding in the mosque, and the Presbyterian minister comes along and I perform this wedding. And one of the nicest things I've ever heard, the best compliment I've ever had, was when David's uncle, who's a Presbyterian minister, came up and he says, "You know, that was a really beautiful service. I wish you'd come to Oban and talk and just come and meet me." And for me, when we talk about, can we have the right page now? Huh? That sums up where Islam and culture should be going, is where people actually are comfortable with themselves and able to function in a society. You'll see that they act like David Duncan or Mo Salah. Any Liverpool fans here? Not that I'm a Liverpool fan, I hope I didn't give that impression. But Mo Salah is a genius. When it comes to football, the man is brilliant. Sorry, he's an Oslo fan. But he's also a very sincere and straight Muslim. You know, he doesn't drink. He reads. You know, when he flew to Madrid, one of the last matches, he read Quran the whole way, and everyone was like taking all these videos of all the team, and he's just sitting there reading. He's just a nice guy. Everybody loves him in the team and around him. Last week, one of the local drug organisations asked him to speak, and he did a short clip, just talking about drugs and saying, you know, drugs is an issue, and if you've got a problem, talk to somebody. That week, 400 referrals were made in Liverpool to the drug rehabilitation clinics. Why? Because Mo Salah is a great footballer, but he's also a great man with high aspiration. Right. If this guy will let me go back to my presentation. I'm going to send you over there. I'm going to go over all of that, just open it up to everybody. In fact, maybe I'll just open it up now. You know what I've got to say. So, are there any comments on that? Maybe I should try and pull it up if I can find it. Idris, I have no idea. I don't know. Let's start there. Yeah.
I have a question, Shaykh. I wonder, thank you for visiting us again. I have heard you many times before. I was in Rabita. So thank you for visiting us again.
Thank you for
what to say
inviting.
first. I want to ask, you mentioned that it can be a problem when people, when you were talking about culture, and was it Hadara? When people are moving from a village to a city
Yeah.
and try to settle down. And here in Norway, many people that have problems with immigrants that are coming to Norway, or let's say Europe in general, they say they are importing their bad cultures or religion. This is a nice mix. And bring it to our country. Let's say I'm a Norwegian now, and they are destroying our Norwegian culture or our European identity, okay? Or our Christian identity here in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
The problem with that is Muslims are like human else. Culture is not a static phenomenon. It's a dynamic process. So even when I have talked with immigrants, let's say for example, I talked one time with a Palestinian man. He said, I have been living here now in Norway for 10 years. But when I'm going back, when I have visited my country, he said, the whole society have changed for me. In his homeland, Palestine, he said, my homeland have changed. For me, it was, he was a little bit shocked about some things that have changed in his country. So then the question is, I almost got out of it. This dynamic process, people will change anyway, even if they bring bad, let's say, habits from their original culture or homeland to Europe. You as a person, you will change your behavior, your culture, even your language. When you are going back for visitation to your homeland after 10, 15 years, you will learn about new words that you did not know when you were living there. So, yeah, that was only my comment. That even if you are bringing, let's say, bad habits, and yes, we have a conflict here in Norway also, like in many European societies, between the first generation and the second generation that I'm a part of, between their habits and their culture, and like you also mentioned that many people are mixing culture into Islam, and it's not Islam. Islam did not say that you are allowed to force marriage your children to someone. That's un-Islamic. So that's only the comment that I wanted to share with you.
I'm not saying that people bring bad habits. What I say is that they bring inappropriate things from their culture. Sometimes they are bad.
Yes,
Sometimes you
that's
do. But it's not, I'm not trying to be judgmental there. What I'm trying to say is it's about appropriateness of what people bring and describe as their culture. And some people hold fast to certain things which are not important, but they become important outside of the country that they live in, because it's the way to hold fast to that, to back home. They want to hold fast to something back home. And that process of holding, of not being able to differentiate between what is appropriate in your culture or appropriate in the way of life that you have for the country, the place that you're living in, that's where the conflict is. It's not that it's bad or good, it's what's appropriate and what can fit and what can allow the next generation to thrive. And if all you give to the next generation is a poor version of your language, you've not really given them anything. And one of the problems, I worked in Muslim schools for many, many years in the UK, and the reason why I don't look for Muslim schools anymore is because I don't think that many of them are actually giving kids high aspirations. I don't think they're giving kids, the next generation, anything which is useful for them to survive culturally or Islamically. And what they're giving them is actually all the negative things to hold fast to something that they think was perfect 50 years ago in Pakistan or wherever it was. And we need to break from that for the community to succeed, and also for people to be able to communicate with each other, because this obviously isolates people from the wider community. And this isn't just about an internal conflict, it's about conflict between that conflicted community and the wider community, and that has political ramifications, and those are the dangers that we see all around us, which is why I'm hoping that we're going to get a discussion. Has anyone got a comment on the gentleman's observation? Maybe the person that said Norwegians are very shy was correct. Please prove it wrong and tell me you're not shy.
I have a comment.
Please.
Lately I'm thinking about why people may have this culture so strongly. I think that in Christian societies, or from my own experience maybe, conservatism may be seen as a religiousness. And maybe this is confusion. This is both comment and question.
I think in part you've actually summarised what a lot of people, what is actually the case, is that some people think conservative means religious, and it doesn't necessarily mean that.
But there is a line, I don't know where to draw that.
Yeah, and I think...
What do you consider? And then often it is understood and also performed as rejecting anything new, rejecting anything modern, rejecting anything Western, rejecting anything,
I mean, some of the best interactions I had around religion were actually with a priest in London. He was appointed by the Bishop of London as the ecumenical priest. Ecumenical meaning bringing the churches together. So he was interested in dialogue. And we were neighbours, we became friends. And the reason why I think we got on so well was because we didn't talk directly about religion. What we talked about was about values, and we had realized that when we talked about equality, when we talked about justice, when we talked about important issues like the environment, for example, we were actually on the same conservative page in some ways. And so conservative in this way was actually a positive quality, but it allowed us both to break out of religiosity and culture. And not everything that is conservative is from the past is bad, but we need to be able to find what are those values in the past, which are the values that are missing now, that we should be starting to try and revive. And for example, I don't think pornography is one of them, because for a start, I don't think it's one of the values of the past. When I was going back to the Danish example, they would say, no, pornography is actually something we should be encouraging because it's part of our culture. And I don't think it necessarily is. I think it's something which is really damaging to society, to people's health. And I don't think it's, I think we should have a discussion about it, but we shouldn't automatically think that this is part of our culture, which we should be fighting for, and likewise we should just fight against it because it's haram, because that doesn't get you anywhere either. But we need to realise what's happening in society and talk correctly and about solving people's issues. And that's why I really found that this time when I was talking with this particular priest, we were working on interfaith dialogue, but it wasn't about let's all sit together, hold hands and pray. There was none of that, because he was from the Church of England. You know, and he would actually used to describe himself as the Catholic Church of England, meaning that he still had aspirations towards what he considered to be the High Church. So he meant Catholic with a small c, not Catholic with a big C. So those conservative values that he had were actually something which I would say was deep embedded in Christian culture. And when we start to talk at that level, you will actually find that there's a real area of dialogue which we're not talking about. And I think you've raised a really important point of and the last point you made was, what are the limits? I really like that comment because it is dangerous, but we need to explore that discussion. And I think if we don't explore that discussion, I think we're not doing justice. And I'm really glad you said that. Anybody else want to add to? Please.
I have another question.
Please.
You briefly spoke about tolerance and how it's one of the most important principles in Islam. Why do you think there is such a lack of tolerance in parts of the Muslim world? And I'm very interested in how you can interpret the same religious scriptures and come to such a different conclusion than other scholars.
I think, first of all, let me just show that I'm not just making this all up. The Quran says, La ikraha fi din, qad tabayyana rushd min al-ghayy. That there is no compulsion in religion, and that truth is made, qad tabayyana rushd min al-ghayy. That the guidance has been made clear from folly, in effect. So, it's not just that I believe in tolerance, it's the Quran actually is established on that. You ask, why do people differ? I think we're going down a very specific route, and can I just be completely politically incorrect and interpret your question in the way that I think you're trying to avoid actually saying? And please throw something at me if I've got it completely wrong. You're saying, why do those idiots who go around killing people justify what they do and use the same book that you're talking about? That's what you're really trying to say, but you're just too nice to say that. Is that right? The answer for me is quite simple, is that there are angry people who have grievances, whether they're legitimate or not, is not my business. There are people with angry grievances who have a lot of hatred in their hearts, who come to the Quran with that hatred, and as a result of that inner hatred, they read the Quran through hatred, and as a result, they see hatred in it. But the motivating factor was their own hatred. And if you look at the typical kind of people that are attracted to ISIS, who I didn't want to mention, and types of like that, are usually people who don't have any foundation in real knowledge, or have no understanding of society. And as social rejects, or people that can't fit in society, it's easier to get on a plane to Turkey and go and kill people and pretend that you're going to go to heaven for doing it, than it is to face up to the reality of, well, how do I become a good husband? Or how can I be a good wife? Or how can I look after this little guy when his mother's ill? That's much tougher than the interpretation of the Quran that they have, which is just, kill them all! Because that's much easier. And it's also kind of funky. You know, when you're an angry young man, that's an easy thing to do. It's much more difficult to say, well, what do I do now with my pal that I've known for so many years? And he's now Muslim, the one that I was talking about. For me, it's not a problem. It ain't a problem. But for other people, it was.
But that was actually why I asked the question.
So how do we get these going back to try and answer directly, because I think I was going around bushes, sorry, because I was reinterpreting your question. The reason why is because those people that interpret in that way are angry people full of hatred, and that's what they are. They are not Muslims who have interpreted the Quran in a scholarly manner. They are angry people who have interpreted it in an angry manner, and because of the hatred that they have, the Quran becomes a vehicle of hatred for them, and they justify their hatred and atrocities using the Quran. Whereas, if you took all of that hatred out and you actually looked at it in a different way, you'll see that they're wrong. And hopefully you'll see that perhaps what I'm saying is more realistic and beneficial and correct. But I'm also willing to debate with any ISIS member that wants to openly offer another alternative to that interpretation. Please.
You know, I was wondering, what source of knowledge should be for this generation who is struggling between, you know, the Pakistani identity, the Norwegian identity, and you're Muslim? And when you go to, you know, there are like several mosques in Norway, and some of them are very, very affected by the cultural aspect.
Yeah.
And the imam there, I think he's more a Pakistani than Muslim now. Just to be correct. And you know, if I want to bring someone who is not Muslim, I know because you know, like everything is in Urdu, and he is still from a village in Pakistan.
I think what we need to do is we need to find spaces for dialogue. And if the mosques don't provide that, go somewhere else and just give up on them. Because they have a function, they do certain things, but for the people that you're talking about, young people, we're trying to find a way forward. If the mosques don't provide that for them, they have to look to find a space, and they're going to make mistakes. I mean, there's a place in London called Ruby's Cafe, and some people refer to it as the Muslim nightclub. And it is a place where people go to meet each other, and that's why it gets late. But it's a space where people need to have dialogue. And okay, there might be some threats, there might be some difficulties in taking that approach, but we have to make mistakes as a community, because we, as young people striving, or people you were talking about, they need to find their way forward. And if the mosques are not providing, they're going to do it themselves anyway. So let's look for a space where we can discuss. That's one of the reasons why I came, is because I understand that this is an organisation that wants to have dialogue, is open to talk about difficult topics, and young people need to talk about difficult topics. Ahmed, his mother is somebody who, she's even more politically incorrect than I am, and I think I learned political incorrectness from her. She would just stand up in the talk and say, "Can you tell me about pornography?" Or she'll stand up and she'll say, "What do you think of cannabis? Is it any different to skunk?" In a talk. You don't get that in mosques. And if you do, she'd be thrown out. She'd be thrown out of most mosques anyway. But she's willing to ask those questions because they're the kind of questions that young people need to talk about. There are people that have come to me over and over again with porn addiction, male and female. And I'm not being judgmental because there's not an issue of judgment here. The person has a difficulty. Let's get to understand how that person gets out of the difficulty. And the only way that I can do that is by talking to them, listening to them, and not say, "Haram! You're going to go to hell!" And that's where you need to find somewhere. You sound like somebody who thinks, I know that your mind is ticking. Find somewhere. I can see your mind working. No? There must be somewhere where we can start, where you can bring your friends, where we can talk. Even somebody's house. You need to bring people together to talk freely, where people can ask those difficult questions and communicate. And unfortunately, you're right. Most of the mosques, you can't.
I have a comment to that.
Please.
I think one of the reasons that the Pakistani culture struggles more with the distinction between religion and culture is because Islam is such a big part of the national identity of the country, because it's embedded in everything that the country has become and the reason it was actually founded. So I think that's one of the reasons that we struggle with it a bit more than other cultures.
You're speaking as a Pakistani?
Yes.
I think that you've made an important point, because I think the partition is still playing with people's identity. 70 years later, it's still a problem. Not just, and the reason I asked you speaking as a Pakistani, because you might be speaking differently if you're from India, and then of course you'd be different if you were speaking from India as a Muslim, or if you were speaking as a Hindu who used to live in what is now called. things are still in people's minds. So I think you're in part right. Another reason that to add to what you've already said, is that immigration patterns to Oslo is that most of the Pakistanis came from the Korea area, and the largest number of people outside of Korea in Pakistan, the largest number of people from Korea outside of Korea is Oslo, followed by Copenhagen. So in some ways they bring what I was talking about, that very, very specific culture. And the migration patterns have not always been as on high aspirations. People didn't come to Norway always because of high aspirations, and they weren't always welcome because they came with high aspirations, whereas the migration patterns to Chicago, for example, are very different. You go to most of the mosques in the Indian mosques or Pakistani mosques, they're mainly doctors, and they're from all over Pakistan, and most of them had parents that were born in the old India and didn't agree with the partition, so it's kind of gone in a different direction. So that personal identity that you're talking about is very specific to, there's another element to it. I hope you're not going to get insulted. If anyone from Korea is here, there's no kind of underlying attack on the people of Korea. Just this is historic fact. You had something to add. Please.
Yeah, a comment about what you said that maybe I misunderstood it, but I don't think we should discourage the youth from going to the mosque, even if the mosque community, the mosque board is difficult, because the way I see it is that in 30, 40 years, these buildings will be empty, okay? So who is going to take care of these buildings? I understand that there are some mosques in Oslo that might have a lot of the cultural issues from back home, but then again, I would still say to the youth that please go to these mosques and try to make a change. Maybe you cannot make the change today or in 5 years, but if we're not going to do it, who's going to do it? Because these are the buildings made for us by our older generation, okay? They did something good and some stuff they brought with themselves. So I think that, I mean, of course it's good to have like communities, you know, have a strong, like invite people over, but never forget the mosque and always try to be related to the mosque in some way.
I stand corrected. That is a valid point, but also the point that I was trying to make to my sister here is that she was talking about a particular direction that the mosque is not serving, and that needs to be met. And we, as a community, and I'm talking about we as a wide community, not just people of Korea that have moved into Oslo, I'm talking about people generally here. We need to find a space for people to start having real dialogue about real issues, because if we don't, we will create monsters. And we have created monsters that have gone away to kill people. And I'm not saying it's anybody's particular fault, I'm just saying we need to get out of this mess. And one of the ways to get out of this mess is to find that space. And you know, one of the reasons you can see it's not that easy to travel for me. And one of the reasons why I felt I did want to come to Oslo was because the discussion that was taking place was that it seems like this is the beginning of a good discussion, and I'd like to support you further in taking this discussion. You know, if ever you get this space for us to talk, you know, I'm willing to come and talk about skunk and pornography. Just looking at me. Please.
But do you see any difference between, you know, the Scandinavian and the UK? Because in Scandinavia there's like the second generation and the third is coming, while in the UK you are up to fourth and fifth generation. And I'm saying, you know, yeah, our parents, you know, they brought their culture with them, but they have struggled a lot, and you know, we have like old assumptions to do differently.
I think that there's obviously a difference between the different communities around Europe. But there are some underlying principles that we need to go to, which is how do people deal with the question of law? That's one of the first things. Is because if one of the gripes of the host communities around Europe, France, England in particular, is that people come here and they want to introduce Sharia. And there's this idea of what they call creeping Sharia, Now we need to be honest about this. We need to have an honest discussion about where do we go for rulings about family. Let's be honest about this. And this is a really controversial and difficult topic which people are not that willing to talk about. I am, and I'm willing to discuss that at any. But we do need to have that discussion. It needs to be done in the context of what's going on in Norway, because Norway has a political system, has political elements to the debate. And it wouldn't be right for me to just dive in. People want to know what my opinion about the law is, I can do. But certainly it needs to be had between people within the Norwegian context, and it needs to be between people who are active in politics. Because if you don't get active in politics, you're not going to be able to influence the discussion. And politics with a small p, I don't say enjoy this part of that part. Can I get what I'm... Yeah. Somebody waving at Walaikum salam.
Really good to see you after all this year back in Oslo.
Thank you.
I'm a bit following up on a couple of the other questions, coming back to the question of principles and now conflicting principles, because we often face conflicting principles. And you brought up yourself the issue of complicated sexualities, and there you have conflicting principles, and I totally agree that we need to talk about this and about all the other issues. But I also think that the question is not only that we talk about it, and how we talk about it. You know, it's not only a question of not throwing the H word in the face of people, but saying it in a soft way. But
sorry.
No, yeah, but I mean, it's also a question about what we say, and I don't think you really addressed that part of the conflicting principles issue.
Yeah.
So,
I think, I mean, I'd be quite happy to come and talk about any topic at length and detail. This is was kind of very broad. For example, when it comes to the question of homosexuality, for example, I think we do need to provide a place for people to feel they can come and discuss their sexuality. The number of people that have come to me with really very, very serious issues in their minds. I'll give you one example. A lad who was, on the surface, looked like the ideal practicing Muslim. He was at the front row of the mosque, he was at the front row of Islamic societies in university, but really struggled in his own mental health, but just didn't let anybody know. Somehow he got to talk to me over the years, and one day he just talked to me, just spoke to me. He says, you know, you won't imagine the nightmares that I have. And he talked about nightmares related to sexuality. And my immediate feeling was, how can I help this person? Not haram or halal. And that's where we need to move from where we were in this debate to where we should be, which is to talk to help people. And maybe I shouldn't have picked that example, but I'm not saying it needs to be thrown down everybody's throat, but we do need to be realistic, and we do need to be honest about helping people. And this person was seriously conflicted, so we need to find that area. So I mean, I'm more than happy to talk in detail. And likewise on the question of family law, I mean, maybe I threw it in the air, maybe I should answer what my view is. In Islamic law, if we take Ibn al-Abidin, and apologies for people that if I'm throwing all of this technical stuff in, the reason why is just that people don't shoot you down afterwards, is that in Islamic law, and I quote Ibn al-Abidin, he says that where the rights of a woman are not being fulfilled by the law, she has a right to go to the judge, the qadi. And where it is not being fulfilled and the qadi has no power, she's entitled, when he refers to qadi, he's talking about a Muslim judge, and when there is no, she is entitled to go to a non-Muslim judge. And this is in the most conservative, traditional text you can find. In other words, that where there is conflict in a marriage, you don't need to go to a Sharia council if it doesn't implement justice. And if a woman is being abused, she doesn't have to take that abuse. She has the right, according to Islam, to go to the police and get something done about it. And she's not being un-Islamic. And therefore family law doesn't have to be in conflict, because the most traditional, the most conservative opinion in the Hanafi madhab allows for divorce through a non-Muslim court. So here we don't have a conflict, really, between Norwegian law and traditional Islamic law. What we have a conflict between is between Muslim practice and their insistence on adherence to those some practices which are, and I'm going to quote, wrong. There are certain things, and this is one of the few things that I'll say absolutely wrong. There is no way ever a man should hit a woman. And I'm just sorry, I maybe consider me a feminist, but where that happens and people justify it, it's wrong. And if somebody brings that practice from any culture, I'll tell them. As far as I know, it's wrong, and I can bring all my Islamic evidences and whatever. And that's why, when this root is there, I don't see a conflict. And therefore, what we need to do is, how does the community work in solving family issues? That's what's important, not whether we have Sharia councils or not. Because, to be honest, most of the Sharia councils that I know of don't function around fairness. And therefore, they don't have any value in my mind. And I'd rather somebody went to the Scottish court and got justice there. I told you I'm not going to invite me back. Marhaba.
Yes, Shaykh. You talked now, mentioned a little bit about women's rights and Sharia, that some people want Sharia, but if we look statistically, when I read about some statistics about practical Muslims, Muslims that were practicing their 5 salats and so on, we are talking about maybe 20% of the total Muslim group. I think we have the same numbers for Norway, and in Indonesia, that is the largest Muslim country as I know, have the same statistics, around 20%. And out of this 20%, maybe you have 2-3% that want Sharia in Europe, for example. Okay, so it's a very small issue, according to me. It's not an issue at all, because not many Muslims living in Europe today, moderate Muslims like you mentioned in earlier of your speech, wants to live a tranquility, peaceful, nice life in harmony with their family. So for me, it's not an issue with Sharia councils like you have in UK. But we have trouble today with young Muslim population now growing up with really big identity issues. And as I have said many times before, when in Europe we have this right-wing movement that have grown over Europe, over the continent for a long time now, then you will get a reaction. Action will always get a reaction. Yeah, learn this in school. So this is for me a bigger issue. Why Norwegian-born children growing up here in this country or in Europe in general don't feel themselves as Norwegians or as British people. They speak the language perfectly, they have adapted to the society perfectly, but they don't feel themselves as a part of the community and the country. That is a big issue. Not if we want Sharia or we want halal slaughtering and so on. Your colleague, Tariq Ramadan, is very clear on this. The day when you land in a non-Muslim country, you must follow the law of that country. And I have never heard in Norway imam that says the opposite. Everyone says you must follow Norwegian law.
Yeah, the media have created a storm, and this is what sets the agenda. And this is why it is an issue, not because of the numbers, but because it's easy to get votes by raising this issue. And that's actually more worrying for me than it is the extreme right wing. It's actually the people that manipulate issues for their own benefit. That's more worrying for me, and especially in a country where we just voted for Brexit, and where that vote was actually used around xenophobia, around things like they would be able to, the Sharia, the word Sharia was used frequently in the Brexit debates. As you say, it's a non-issue in real terms, but it's become, and the consequence of that is that people that look Muslim get beaten up. People that look Polish get beaten up because there was this twin campaign in depending on where the Brexit campaign was going. In some places it was against Poles, and it was just that the Polish people have done this, Polish people have done that, Polish people have that. My Polish Muslim friends were probably the ones that got a double. And this issue of Sharia, it was part of that debate. That's what's more worrying for me than actually the extreme right wing, because if people want to debate, let's talk. I'm happy to talk with anybody. Right wing, left wing, but this manipulation is what I'm worried about. Please.
I'm just going to comment to what you said right now, because specifically pertaining to the Sharia Council, because I feel like there's two understandings on how we approach specifically this discussion, and specifically when it comes to the Sharia. We have like an outside perspective where, for most cases, the idea of Sharia from a non-Muslim perspective is 10 times out of 10 over-exasperated, like it's exaggerated, where it's, we want to implement the Sharia hudud, and, the parts we can only implement if there's a full-on Muslim society instead of like, in Europe. But also we have the idea, and that's also, I would like to tie this into, my cultural understanding of Sharia, that from a Somali Muslim background, where when it comes to issues such as marriage, and particularly pertaining to divorce and stuff like that, what I've seen in the Somali community is that instead of essentially like going to an imam or so on and so forth, we turn to the elders of our family. So they then step in and sort out the dispute between them. But in many cases, specifically in pertaining to Norway, and even in many cases in England as well, even though there are Sharia councils more or less in England, and it has a stronger threshold there than it does here in Norway, majority of the time it's just, like I said, like an over-exaggeration. It barely exists. There's no one that goes around and either gets a divorce through a Sharia council, or even this idea of implementing Sharia, like very small fringes of the society have taken a very extreme understanding, because if you lived in Norway for so long, and even in Europe, where the Western civilization, like this cultural identity of European values and so on and so forth, even if you wanted the Sharia to be implemented here, it would take a long, long time before that is ever idealized in society. So I feel like in many cases it's over-exaggerated.
Yeah, I think you just confirmed the conjunctive yourself, but I think you've made a side point which is really very, very important about a particular element of your community, which is something which I feel has failed, and that's why Sharia councils in the UK have established, was that you said that in the Somali community we have respect for the communities, the tribes, and as a result, and family structures, and as a result, family issues can be often dealt with within families, and people don't feel isolated. Generally, I think that's what it should be.
That's what it is.
And for a large, and that's possibly why the Sharia councils in England are very ethnocentric, and you don't find any Somali imams on there, and Somali community don't really contribute to that. My worry, though, is perhaps my role in Glasgow needs to be. I work. I'm a professional teacher, and I've always been from qualifying worked in education. I've never ever taken a penny from the community. I've never been employed. And the reason why I'm very strict about that is because no one tells me what to do, and no one tells me what to say. Whereas I know my colleagues in mosques may believe what I say, but will never be able to publicly say it. Now that's a good relationship I have with some of the imams, to the extent that some people will come to the mosque and they'll know that they can't do anything about this particular situation, and they'll say, go speak to Abdul Aziz. Now, the reason why I'm happy with that, because people that are not being served by the community end up on my doorstep. And as I've said, my wife is very supportive, and I'm content with that. But among a lot of those people that end up on my doorstep are women who are not strictly abused, many of them are, but are not in the strict sense of the word, but have been mentally abused, or where the family structure has actually worked against them. You will do this because you will bring dishonor on my family. I know it's wrong what he's doing, but you will not get... And that pressure from families to do the wrong thing is what pushes people out towards this. And Sharia, it does cause a lot of difficulties, and I've got first-hand experience with lots of women, and perhaps that's why I feel passionate about it, but that's why the Sharia councils are so dangerous, because all they do in many ways is they condone that very same attitude. They don't talk about what's right and what's wrong, but they condone and they support that family pressure, which in the case of, in my experience of the Somali community and the Swahili community, which is the one that I know a bit better, they tend to be a bit more honest and a bit more fair and a little less judgmental and superficial when it comes to these kind of matters. And I'll give you an example. Two people, they decide to get married, and then they decide it wasn't right for them. They come to me and they say, look, what shall we do? Simple. We thought we were right for each other, we've decided we're not, and I don't want to marry her. And he doesn't want to marry me. She doesn't. I don't want to marry her, he doesn't want to marry me. It's a simple answer, isn't it? What do? You don't get married. Everyone's going to say that. Except the parents, and the cousins, and the uncles. What do they say? You get married and then get divorced. You're not bringing shame on us. We have paid for the invitations. How dare you not get married? And so this pressure that's put on the families is just unfair. And these many Sharia councils, all they do is they perpetuate cultural pressures. And if they did go back to the model that you were talking about, it actually works very well, where somebody comes to me and says, let's talk to your uncle. Let's go and speak to your uncle. We talk to the uncle and says, let's go and speak to his uncle. Let's talk, come around the table, let's try and work how we can help the couple find a way forward. And if they can find a way forward together, great. And if they can't, let's find a way forward where they're separate. But let's work together to do this. And when, in my experience, and I think this is what you're talking about, where that works, it works, and that's how it should be. And that's actually correct. Arbitration is the right way. The verse of Christ is you bring somebody that's wise from her side and from his side, you come down and you try and solve the problem. And you've got a good point there. I think people are more interested in you than they are in me, actually. That's why no one's asking any questions, difficult questions. Please.
Just maybe because I know you've been traveling a lot, and also I know you've been in Singapore as well. And I've also lived in Singapore for half a year, and I have a few friends there. Actually, I'm going to send some salam from Sister Nazira. I sent her a picture, and she said, please give him salam. So basically, what I've seen in that region is that it's so peaceful, loving, awesome akhlaq, and it's just so great. But then when we talk about Islam here in Europe, we often talk about the Pakistani community, the Middle East, the troubles, and everything. So I mean, what have you seen in that region, which you believe you might can implement here, and what you see is the difference between the European Islamic environment we have here for the past 40, 30, 50 years, and what do you see of like for that region, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, any like insights or tips or your thoughts about that?
Cappuccinos. You know Masjid Balawi?
Yes.
My favourite mosque in the whole world is a mosque in Singapore, and please, if ever you go there, just pop in there and just say, a guy called Abdul Aziz said this is a great mosque, can I have a coffee? Because they do absolutely amazing coffees. And it's open to anybody. You just walk in and help yourself to a coffee. And my wife, before she was my wife, she heard me tell this story about how wonderful this mosque was. And she didn't believe me. And when she got there, she was really angry. You didn't tell them they had 3 coffee machines with 3 choices of beans? No, that wasn't the point of the coffee machine. The point of what I was trying to say was it was open. And anybody could just walk in. They don't actually have doors. They have curtains which close over the arches to make sure that the rain doesn't come in. It's a completely open mosque. And when I say open, it means open in mentality. She couldn't understand how women could just walk in and nobody would bat an eyelid. You know, nobody even asked, you know, you're Muslim or not. It wasn't an issue. And there were people living in the mosque who weren't Muslim. And she was saying, wow, what kind of Muslim? It was just so open, and that openness is what we need to get. And the reason why, one of the reasons why, is because the founder of that mosque, Muhammad bin Salim, he set these principles as how he interacted with other human beings. And as a result of that, he built a climate, or developed a climate, by bringing good people around him. Even if you go to, and it's not just this one mosque, there's a Buddhist temple which is exactly the same. There's a church which is exactly the same. I was there on Christmas, and the local bishop would pop in and wish us Merry Christmas. And everybody was happy. Happens to be the Imam's birthday as well, so he was doubly happy because he gets 2 cakes. But that openness is what we needed. That was one element. And the second is that Singapore is a very, very structured society. Things don't happen by accident in Singapore. Nothing happens by accident. It's all planned. Everything is structured. This is the master of structure. And you're not allowed to you go to jail for dropping chewing gum on the floor in Singapore. It's where they plan where society is going. I'm not saying that that's what we need to do. But one of the things is it's illegal to blaspheme across any religion. So if one community considers something to be blasphemous, you're not allowed to say it. So you can't attack Christianity. It's not allowed. It's illegal. It's illegal to attack Islam. It's illegal to attack Buddhism. It's illegal. So certain things are just off the agenda. You're not allowed to go down that road. And in some ways, people might think, well, that's a bit extreme, and it is. If you ask me why is it successful, but that's one of the elements of success, is because they do restrict what people can say. And in this case, they're restricted in a way which actually works for building a good society, a healthy society. Now, I'm not saying that that works everywhere, but that you ask me why does it work, and that's one of the reasons, is because you can't just attack another religion or another community. And if you do, you will be in jail. And that's it's pretty serious out there. And they do.